Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining. My name is Soledad Leal Campos. I'm Senior Policy Advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, in the Geneva office. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to warmly welcome you all to this session entitled A Stakeholder Perspective on Trade, Environment, and Sustainable Development, which is being held in the context of the WTO Trade and Environment Week, which has successfully started earlier today. This stakeholder dialogue will feature an in-depth discussion on some of the key issues at the heart of the trade, environment, and sustainable development nexus. This dialogue will be informed, among other elements, by some of the overarching themes under discussion in the WTO, by the main takeaways from the sustainability stream of the Geneva Trade Week, held at the end of September, as well as by IISD's own research and engagement. Through this session, our aim is to bring all elements and communities together in order to address the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in these policy areas, as well as to explore options to foster further collaboration across the various stakeholders which participate in this space. In order to achieve this, as you may see from the agenda on your screens, our event will unfold as follows. After the opening remarks to be delivered by Ms. Natalie Bernasconi Osterwalder, who is the Executive Director for IISD Europe, Ambassador Chad Blackman, who is the Permanent Representative of Barbados to the United Nations and other international organizations and Chair of the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment, the CTE, will share a status update on the CTE discussions as well as his views on the main challenges and opportunities ahead. Then my colleague Peter Gooders, who is Group Director Energy at IISD, will give a summary of the main takeaways of the discussions held within the trade and sustainability stream in the context of the Geneva Trade Week I just referred to, where IISD was the thematic partner for the sustainability stream. He will be followed by 3 speakers who will share perspectives on the challenges and opportunities around some of the policy issues raised. These speakers are Mr. Rashid S. Kaukab, who is Executive Director at COTS International, Geneva, Ms. Isabel Jarrett, who is the manager of the program to reduce harmful fisheries subsidies at the Pew Charitable Trusts, and Dr. Caroline Bierbeck, who is Senior Researcher at the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. We will then open the floor for questions from participants. Before giving the floor to Natalie for her introductory remarks, our colleagues and I thought it would be a good idea to launch a quick anonymous poll to get to know you, our audience, a little bit. In particular, we would like to get a sense of the degree of familiarity with the WTO and the WTO agreements, as well as with the trade and environment debate and interlinkages. My colleague and dear friend Sofia Balino, who is the Editorial and Communications Manager in the ELP program at IISD, we launch this poll and together we will look at these results. Sophia, could we please launch the poll? Okay, should we? I see that you're still responding. Yeah. So based on the results, 63% of participants mentioned that they are very familiar because this is their field of work or study. We are talking about the WTO agreements. 32% consider them somewhat familiar and 5% are not familiar at all. Thanks very much for responding to this question. Should we go to the next one, please? Okay, thanks very much. So your answer to the question, how familiar are you with the trade and environment interlinkages? 55% of participants consider themselves very familiar because that's their field of work or study. 43% are somewhat familiar, while 2% are not familiar at all. Thanks very much for participating. This gives us very important information for our presentations. And so now I would like to, based on this, to give the floor to my colleague and boss, Ms. Natalie Bernasconi Osterwalder, for her introductory remarks. But before doing that, I wanted to mention that some of you may know Natalie through her work on investment law and policy, but also some of you may remember her from her work on trade and environment. And actually, this is a little anecdote because the way I got to know Natalie was through her research on trade and environment in the early years of the Doha round, when I was a permanent delegate here in charge of precisely the trade and environment issues. So at that time, Natalie shared her manuscript that she was preparing with other colleagues on WTO jurisprudence on trade and environment. I never imagined that over a decade and a half later, I will be part of her team and I will be sharing a panel with her. So Natalie, on this note, I give you the floor for your introductory remarks. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks so much. That's very kind of you. And also, yeah, you never know, what colleagues you end up working with, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I feel like there are probably a lot of people on this call who have been working on these issues for a long time, because I was very impressed how many people have been looking at, they're very, familiar with the WTO law and also the interlinkage of environment and trade. So thank you very much for that. And it's really a great pleasure to open this session. And as Soledad said, it's something that's close to my heart. It's an area that I used to work on a lot. And before beginning, I would like to take the occasion to thank the UK government for supporting IISD's work on trade and sustainable development and making these discussions and our research, reporting and capacity building work possible. So many thanks for that. So IISD has actually been following the trade discussions dating back a long time, even beyond or before the creation of the WTO, going back to GATT times, because the trade and environment debate really does have a very long history, and at times a stormy history, with sometimes opposing interests clashing. You just think about protecting sea turtles on the one hand and protecting market access for fishing industries on the other. We think about protecting the environment and eliminating dengue breeding grounds in old tires through the recycling of tires on the one hand, and protecting market access for tire manufacturers on the other. And so sometimes, even consumers want more from trade now than just low prices and huge choice. They really increasingly want to know how their product was produced. How did the production and transport of the product of choice affect climate change, biodiversity, and forests? And all these interests demand policy responses that actually have impact beyond the border. And that needs to be assessed against the backdrop of trade rules, of trade disciplines and frameworks. So these disciplines are really meant to provide a balance between the different interests with the ultimate goal of achieving sustainable development. And now, of course, this might sound straightforward, but of course it isn't, and has led to very long conversation and controversies that keep popping up in different forms. Although I would love to, today, of course, we don't have the time to look in detail at this relationship, but needless to say, the discussions and the quest for solutions really must go on, and it has become more important than ever. And this is why we're very pleased to be here with all of you today, and to thank also the WTO for providing a platform for these discussions this whole week and opening them up to stakeholders. We're very pleased today to welcome the current chair of the Committee on Trade and Environment, Ambassador Blackman of Barbados. The WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment has a 25-year-old history since it was created, and was given the specific mandate to identify and understand the relationship between trade and environment from a sustainable development perspective. Over the years, an increasing number of intergovernmental organizations have participated in those discussions as observers, including the various secretariats from multilateral environmental agreements, from UNEP, UNECE, UNCTAD, and many others. We sometimes underestimate, I think, the role of these exchanges, focusing maybe too much on what is happening in ongoing negotiations and starting new ones. but actually having a multilateral platform for regular discussion without the pressure of closing a deal has a very particular and important value for building bridges. We therefore very much look forward to hearing Ambassador Blackman's views on the current state of play of the discussions at the CTE, at the Committee on Trade and Environment. And we're also very pleased to give a platform to non-governmental actors who are unfortunately not currently allowed to participate in the deliberations of the committee and to provide their views and their points of views to the chair. This week will be full of interesting discussions ranging from plastics, fossil fuel and fisheries subsidies, and the circular economy. And IISD will be reporting on all of these discussions and providing a basis for dialogue and further analysis. And I may also take the occasion to share with you that we have launched a reporting stream on trade together with the IISD Knowledge Hub, where we bring together trade and sustainable development worlds and bridge different communities. And another tool is the Trade Quarterly publication that we will be launching in the next few days, also to support policymakers and other stakeholders to keep them up to date on developments on trade and sustainable development. We really, just to close, we need to find ways to work on trade and environment policy making in a way that contributes meaningfully to environmental objectives and tackles global challenges. Multilateralism must be at the heart of all these efforts. But at the same time, the discussion really needs to be inclusive and very mindful on the impacts that environmental policy can have on developing economies. And we have to come up collectively with coherent policy options that really don't only look at the environment and not only at the economic perspectives, but everything together, and also including the social aspects, thus all three pillars of sustainable development. I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to the next hour to hear from all of you. So Soledad, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie, for your introductory comments, which set the scene for our conversations this afternoon. It is now my great pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Chad Blackman, Permanent Representative of Barbados to the United Nations and other international organizations, and Chair of the WTO CTE. Ambassador Blackman will share a status update on the discussions in the CTE, as well as his views on some of the challenges and opportunities ahead, and in particular, some possible messages to be conveyed to stakeholders who are joining us here today. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, or perhaps even good night, depending on where you are joining us from in the world. Let me first say thank you very much to IISD for this very kind invitation. And let me also thank you for hosting this stakeholder engagement. It is both very critical and very timely, given where we are in this current global reality. As you know, this event takes place alongside the WTO Trade and Environment Week 2020. When I started to facilitate discussions on WTO Trade and Environment Week, I personally felt that it would be very important for civil society to contribute. I'm very glad to see that the IISD and other stakeholders have responded to this call in a very strong way. I just finished moments ago moderating the WTO UNEP high-level event that kicked off the WTO Trade and Environment Week. It was a very fruitful and productive exchange. We heard from top trade and environment officials on their vision to ensure that we build back better and greener from this very horrible pandemic and make sure that our policies are better aligned towards ensuring that we reach outcomes that are sustainable. We also heard from two leading personalities from the business and civil society on the huge opportunities from more sustainable and circular economies and the role that trade and WTO can and must play in helping us seize those opportunities as well. These important messages will be conveyed to delegations in the Committee on Trade and Environment this coming Friday when we resume the CTE meeting. The WTO UNEP high-level segment kickstarts a series of events and workshops hosted by WTO members, many of them in close collaboration with stakeholders. These events will explore a host of pressing environmental challenges and their trade implications, including plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, fossil fuel subsidy reform, the very popular climate change, natural disasters, and recovery efforts. We will also be hearing from young people here in Geneva on how they expect trade to contribute to their future. I am very much looking forward to this week. I am confident that the discussions will be a source of inspiration for those of us trying to chart a way and a path forward on the issues of trade and the environment, especially in these challenging and unprecedented times. This is the second year in a row that a series of member-led events and workshops are being held in conjunction with the Fall Committee meeting. We have seen how these events can plant the seed of constructive engagement and new approaches to complex trade and environment issues. Indeed, the last few years have seen a positive step change in how the WTO members approach trade and environment discussions. Not only has the number of WTO members actively participating in the CTE's work increased significantly, but also we have seen the discussions become very substantive, very, very focused. Just have a look at the minutes of recent CTE meetings to get a sense of this growing momentum. And I must take this opportunity to thank my predecessor, Jean-Marie Pogam of France, who would have laid a very strong foundation amongst obviously the other chairs before. But I really think within the last year or two, he has really led a trail that must be commended. So to Ambassador Pogam of France, I say thank you very much. What's more, WTO members have used the CTE quite successfully to identify several areas with potential for more concrete action. And these include, firstly, the circular economy, and in particular, how trade policy can help overcome obstacles along the value chains that underpin recycling and other resource-saving activities that minimize emissions and waste. The removal of environmentally harmful distortions, including an initiative by a group of WTO members to reform fossil fuel subsidies. Thirdly, trade and plastics pollution, including tomorrow's inaugural meeting of an informal dialogue on plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade. Fourthly, trade and environmental sustainability, including an initiative by the Group of Friends of Advancing Sustainable Trade, commonly known as FAST, to be launched tomorrow for structured discussions towards specific proposals for the next WTO ministerial conference slated for next year. Importantly, very important, the structured discussions are also viewed as a tool to deepen engagement with stakeholders. I think that this enhanced engagement is a recognition by trade officials of several realities. First, it is becoming increasingly harder to deny the disruptive effects of environmental degradation on our economies, including on trade. Trade officials cannot continue to sit on the sideline. They are expected to put forward their views and solutions on how trade can promote sustainability in a more proactive manner. Secondly, these environmental challenges rarely respect national borders, as we have seen. They are global in nature, and as such, they call for sustained international cooperation. And this also became very clear in the just concluded high-level panel, the need for inter-organizational and intergovernmental dialogue and cooperation. The multilateral system, including the WTO, has an important role to play. The SDGs and Agenda 2030 themselves recognize their contribution of trade to turn the goals into reality. Thirdly, there is a growing recognition that aligning trade and environmental policies is not only a sustainability imperative, but also a source of valuable opportunities for economic growth and diversification. Members, in particular developing countries, are looking for ways in which they can support their domestic producers and entrepreneurs to tap into the growing markets for sustainability, and also to ensure that they can also reap the economic and trade benefits of the transition towards a more sustainable and inclusive global economy. I'm therefore very encouraged that delegations have taken up the issue of sustainable trade this week, especially in the very challenging and trying context in light of the current global pandemic. It is becoming increasingly evident that they see trade and environment as a crucial part of the future work of this great organization, WTO. You have an important role in helping members to keep the momentum, the positive momentum going. COVID-19 is a stark reminder that we must change our relationship with nature and align our economies towards a sustainable development path. There are many other environmental challenges ahead of us that might make the social, economic, and health impacts of this pandemic pale in comparison if we do not act, not least the unprecedented loss of biodiversity and the perils of climate change. So let's keep this discussion going. I truly believe that there are many untapped opportunities for WTO members to make trade work better for both people and for planet. Your voices, along with those of other stakeholders, can help WTO members grasp those opportunities. Your voices must be heard. Your voices also can help WTO members modernize in a way that we have never done before. And I've always said that we should never waste a good crisis, and I think that this moment presents us with a very unique opportunity to do so. Your voices can help align the WTO with needs and values of a growing part of the world's population, including young people. And it's also one of the very deliberate things that we decided this week, to have a very real dialogue with the young people if we're going to get this change to be one that is also sustainable, because we can have change that's a short-term thing and it's not long-term, there's no longevity. If there's going to be sustainable change, we have to ensure that our young people are part of the discourse now. And it is one of those reasons, therefore, that on Thursday, you're going to see a very rich dialogue with the young people based in Geneva, with our governments and stakeholders on how do we rebuild the world with the imagination of our young people. So it's great to count on your support, and you also have my support as well as the chair of the CTE, and I look forward to this very rich and very timely and very critical discussion. I thank you.
Many thanks, Ambassador Blackman, for your insightful intervention. Thanks for sharing with us some of the areas that WTO members have been discussing. You mentioned that they have undertaken new approaches to complex trade and environment issues, and you have highlighted at least 4 areas where discussions are being held and will be presented again this week. You have also mentioned the importance of engagement from civil society and of coordinated policy responses. Thanks very much for reminding us of the importance of keeping the momentum going. Thanks very much. We will come back to you with questions after our speakers. I will now ask my colleague, Mr. Peter Wooders, who is the Group Director, Energy at IISD, to please present the main takeaways from the discussions on trade and sustainability held in the context of the Geneva Trade Week, organized by the Geneva Trade Platform, where IISD was a thematic partner for the sustainability stream. Peter, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Soledad, and thank you, Ambassador Blackman, for firstly your support to everyone across this trade and environment issue, but also for your support to IISD and for this event too. We really appreciate that. So I'm going to very quickly try and run through a summary of what happened at the Geneva Trade Week, which was at the end of September and beginning of October this year. Just try and put this onto slideshow. There we go. So if you want some further details on this and some more detail than I can do in the following 5 minutes, please do have a look at IISD's SDG Knowledge Hub. The web address is there, SDG IISD. I can't even see it, it's just here. just in the bottom right of your screen there, and there's some more details on that. So to the sustainability pillar of Geneva Trade Week. So Geneva Trade Week was organised by the new Geneva Trade Platform, and IISD was the thematic partner for the sustainability stream. I'm pleased to say that sustainability was the most popular pillar of the whole week. So between us, we received 34 session proposals on sustainability. Those were narrowed down into 14, some were combined. And there was a high level plenary as well. That was more than any of the other 3 pillars. Then there was a big, a wide range of groups became involved in here, 44 organizations, 87 speakers, almost 1,000 people participated during the day via WebEx. And then at the same time, there was also YouTube and Vimeo, and another 3,500 people were able to participate during the week on those too. And also, I think one of the main things that comes out of this, apart from the very strong interest in trade and environment as an issue, is also how widely the idea of sustainability was couched in these sessions and what came up. And on the right-hand side of the screen here are what the sessions were about. Some of them are very clear. They'll be about climate, about the new border carbon adjustment that is being put forward by the EU. Maybe Canada will have one. The US new administration has been talking about it. So very much an important issue there as countries look to move towards ambitious climate goals, net zero and others. How are they going to then protect some of their producers, and also very important to consider what will be the impacts of those on developing countries. Fossil fuel subsidies, as Ambassador Blackman mentioned, a lot of progress being made there on understanding the effects of those on the effects of fossil fuel subsidies on trade, which occur across the subsidy, all the types of subsidies, be they consumer or producer, and then some of the mechanisms that could be done for an eventual agreement on those around exceptions and prohibitions and development issues and all the other key factors. Then we've already mentioned about circular economy and plastic pollution, but biodiversity and natural resources came up strongly, food security and the financing of it, overfishing, ocean health, fisheries subsidies we'll hear about. WTO put forward a session on diseases of animal origin, looking at zoonotic diseases and how they might come forward and how we might react. And then a lot on production and supply chains, and then on the voluntary sustainability standards around those. And then in capitals at the bottom, global sustainability agenda. The most popular session of the week was actually run by the UK, and they put their session around global sustainability in general, and that was the theme of the plenary as well that IISD organised. If you want any more detail on anything to do with this sustainability stream, have a look at genevatradeweek.ch, and you can come up with, let me get this right, there are all the YouTubes of all the various sessions that were held. This is from the plenary and the 6 speakers there, and you can listen to the whole thing again as you wish. And I'm just going to use this to go through. We could look at any of the sessions that were held. The first session was Sweden in the week. They talked about mechanisms for trade and climate change. I could have highlighted that for this intervention here, but I'll look at the plenary and how that sort of brought together some of the key issues and what the actions were. We had as our first speaker there, John Merton, who's the UK's COP26 envoy. And we asked all the speakers, what would be your short-term and long-term priorities? In the short term, he wanted to see the abolition of export subsidies for coal and around coal-fired power stations, and in the long term, stressing very much the idea of carbon neutrality and how we might get to that. Then we had Elizabeth Wilson, Isabel Jarrett's colleague from the Pew Charitable Trusts. She highlighted the need to get to the fisheries subsidies conclusion by the end of 2020, and then thinking more about oceans and about their health, looking then at trade policy being ambitious when we're looking at plastic pollution in the oceans and elsewhere. Suri Moon joined us from the Graduate Institute here in Geneva on the health side and asked for more funding and political support for technology transfer in health, with, of course, a very, very strong link there into the ongoing pandemic, and then looking to see IP rules being on the same sort of footing as other key highlights in the trade debate. We were very fortunate to have Alberto Mushanga from the Commission for Trade and Industry of the African Union, and he very strongly highlighted the needs to look at poverty reduction to boost agricultural investments And then when we're thinking about the multilateral trading system in general, make sure that that is focused on development. Alexander Shestakov joined us from the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, and mentioned again the fiscal arrangements and the incentives that Ambassador Blackman spoke about there, reforming all subsidies harmful to biodiversity, and then this idea of mainstreaming biodiversity as one of the sort of crises that we have at the moment into all policy, and that of course includes trade. And then we had Mustafa Kamal Gay, who'll be known to a lot of you from the ILO. He's the coordinator of the Green Jobs Program there, and looking there, very much stressing the need to promote employment and decent work, to support innovation, sustainable entrepreneurship, and to boost productive capacity going forward. So that's a very quick summary of what came out of that Geneva Trade Week. I think to summarize, very wide scope of what is sustainability. It's the three pillars of sustainability, not purely environmentalism, but also the social and the environmental side. And also just how many actors there were that were interested and engaged in that process. And I think, again, just reiterating the theme that Ambassador Blackman brought up, that this trade and environment debate is getting stronger and stronger, more and more participants, obviously more urgent as it goes forward, and a clear need for us all to work together as much as we can and to help to push this agenda forward. So plenty more details of this can be found on ours and other websites, and I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Peter, for your intervention highlighting the main takeaways from the sustainability pillar in the context of the Geneva Trade Week. Thanks very much. Now, I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, who is Mr. Rashid S. Kaukab, Executive Director, CUTS International. Rashid, we would be very interested in your perspective on the challenges and opportunities around some of the policy issues raised by previous speakers, as well as others that you consider important. In particular, we would welcome your views on how to approach the trade and environment agenda from a development perspective. Please, Rashid, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm very grateful to Natalie, IISD, to give me this opportunity and for organizing this event. And Madam Chair, your questions are billion-dollar questions, so I'll try, but I wish I had the answers to those questions. I have been on the scene, as some of you know, for quarter of a century, and have worked with several of you over these years, which has been a pleasure and a great learning experience. So while reflecting for this session and to see what issues I can talk about, I came to the conclusion that I have to start with some context issues. I think these are really important, particularly me coming from a developing country perspective. I represented Pakistan in the WTO in the late 90s, participated in CT discussions at that time, and then have worked in Geneva on these issues for a number of years now with CUTS. So the context, I think, is really, really important. And that's where development remains the overarching objective of developing and least developed countries. And trade is a means to achieve that. It is also recognized very clearly when I talk to stakeholders from developing countries that development has to be inclusive and holistic. And SDGs provide a comprehensive framework for that. COVID pandemic, through its impact, as well as the response measures, which in their magnitude vary greatly across the developing and developed world, again, very strongly eliminated the very limited capacity and sustainable development needs of a large number of developing countries. B, trade and trading system, on the one hand, cannot work in a silo, and on the other, are not a panacea for every challenge that we face. They are part of global governance architecture, and different parts of this architecture should be in harmony with each other. And C, we must not overlook the fact, and I think Natalie was referring to that there are tensions and there are trade-offs. That's why it is not surprising that the interpretation of the term sustainable development, as well as the contours of our sustainable development agenda, is not the same for different stakeholders. We can hear many, many different views and perspectives on that. At the bottom of that, in my opinion, it is not just a question of understanding, but also a question of trust, which I don't think exists in all cases. So this context demands a thoughtful, calibrated, and inclusive approach to identifying and working towards the issues in that agenda that can contribute to the achievement of SDGs and also build trust. And that would pave the way for the longer term work towards an agreed sustainable agenda and its implementation. So in this context, several issues I would like to mention, and I would say there are three, at least in my mind, there are three categories of that, starting within the WTO, but also looking a little bit beyond the WTO and the trade area, and then an issue which is very close to my heart, the climate change and trade relationship. In the WTO, I recall from my days at that time of more than 20 years ago, there was a term that we used in the WTO, and I'm sure this is still being used, which is identifying win-win-win scenarios. That is, the scenarios, the outcomes that are good for growth and development, that are good for environment, and that are good for trade. And from their perspective, I will identify four issues, which have already been mentioned by Ambassador Blackman and Peter. And I'm sure these will be mentioned by later speakers as well. So yes, the fisheries subsidies, clearly a commitment, a mandate, an achievement under the SDGs also, where it should be delivered. But also let me add, and as I understand, Isabel is going to talk about in more greater detail about that. But let me bring back again another subsidy issue, which I don't hear very much, agricultural subsidies, which is actually an agenda that predates all of these. This was part of the Uruguay round, something that should have been delivered on a long time ago. So let's put it back again in the front of the agenda. And then, of course, as Peter mentioned, the issue of biodiversity, which is also already part of what we can call the Doha agenda, where the relationship between CBD and TRIPS agreement is to be addressed. And that is not only developing countries, but a large number of developed countries also support that agenda. To this three issues of, let's say, from the older agenda, let me add one more, which is trade in plastic waste. Which I think can again bring benefits both for development, trade, and also for environment. Now, very briefly, in these 5 minutes, I will be rushing that. I would not limit myself to just the WTO. Now let me go beyond that. And now I'm addressing more the developing and least developed country stakeholders. They have their own South-South regional trade agreements. And they should seriously look at integrating relevant environmental dimensions into those negotiations and implementation of those RTAs, because that will give them a chance to identify and incorporate those environmental elements which are based on their needs, their concerns, and their capacities, instead of responding to an agenda that they sometimes believe is being set by others. Finally, the third issue I wanted to talk about is trade and climate change. Actually, that is not only close to my heart, but also our organization have been working on that, the linkages between trade and climate change for a number of years. And that's where I want to point out the need for building bridges, for bringing closer the trade and climate change constituencies, policymakers, and negotiators. Through our work, we discovered that it's not only developing countries, but even some developed countries where their trade and climate change policymakers and negotiators were not following what the others were doing. So by bringing them together, by exposing them to the work by each other, there is a greater chance that the common understanding will be developed, which can then allow the two fora, the trade fora of the WTO and the climate change of UNFCCC to work more synergetically. So these are the three sets of issues that I wanted to talk about. Let me just now, I think I have taken more than 5 minutes. Thank you, Soledad, for your patience, just the last minute. Let me also say that what Ambassador Blackman was saying, that this great shock of COVID-19 pandemic, which by the way, none of us had witnessed such a big challenge in our lifetimes, it should also be an opportunity to sit back, to reflect, and then to look at the issues of development, environment, inclusivity in a holistic fashion, and trade, and find solutions that are of benefit to, as Ambassador Blackman said, both for all our people as well as the planet. Thank you.
Many thanks, dear Rashid, for this very insightful intervention. I have taken 2 pages of notes, I think, and I imagine that my colleagues did so. Thanks very much for highlighting the centrality of development. You mentioned that development is the overarching objective, and development has to be inclusive and holistic. You have highlighted at least 4 issues that we should consider, among them fishery subsidies, agricultural subsidies, biodiversity, trade in plastic waste, and you also mentioned climate change. I will not try to summarize what you shared with us. I think that we will receive questions from participants and also from other speakers following your very rich intervention. I would like now invite our next speaker to take the floor. Our next speaker is Ms. Isabel Jarrett. As I mentioned, she's the manager of the program at the Pew Charitable Trust to reduce harmful fishery subsidies. Isabel, we would very much welcome your views on how a meaningful fisheries subsidies agreement could contribute to more mutually supportive trade and environment policies. In particular, what would be some of the messages that you would like to convey to WTO members today on the immediate actions that are needed from a sustainable development perspective? Thanks very much, Isabel.
Thank you, Soledad, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to participants from around the world. And I'm honored to be here alongside such distinguished panelists. And thank you to IISD for inviting me to speak. And also thank you to Ambassador Blackman for emphasizing the importance of hearing from civil society as part of this broader discussion of trade and environment. As Soledad mentioned, my name is Isabel Jarrett, and I am the manager of the Pew Charitable Trust's project to end harmful fishery subsidies. And our role is to support WTO members to reach a meaningful agreement to end harmful fishery subsidies in line with the SDG Sustainable Development Goal 14 Target 6, which of course the deadline for which is this year. So I will be speaking about the need to conclude these negotiations by the end of this year. As the chair of the negotiations often says, these discussions have been going on for more than 20 years, so making them old enough to be able to drink and vote in most members' jurisdictions, which I think reminds us of the real need to conclude these negotiations. In 2020, WTO members have not 1 but 2 political mandates for action. One, as I mentioned, is UN Sustainable Development Goal 14 Target 6, which was universally adopted in 2015 and tasks governments with reaching an agreement at the WTO to end harmful fishery subsidies by the end of this year. The second mandate is the ministerial decision coming from the last ministerial conference in Buenos Aires in 2017, which committed members to reaching an agreement in time of the next ministerial conference. And in 2020, more so than when these negotiations started, we have more data telling us of the damage that we are wreaking on our ocean and of the urgent need to act. So before I speak more to the negotiations and to the message that I would like to transmit from civil society today, please allow me to give just a bit of context as to why these negotiations are so important. As you may know, the oceans represent 70% of the Earth's surface. Every second breath we take is thanks to the oceans. Evidently, a healthy ocean is needed for life on Earth and for our life on Earth. But unfortunately, we haven't been terribly good stewards of our resources. Last year, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as IPES, found that the biggest threat to marine biodiversity is overfishing, and that's entirely human-led. Indeed, more than a third of the world's fish stocks are overfished. That means they're currently being fished beyond sustainable limits. Another 60% are fished to their maximum sustainable point. More than 1 billion people rely on fish as their main source of protein. The global fish supply chain employs an estimated 250 million people worldwide. So in order to have healthy economies, we need to ensure we have a healthy global environment, and that includes the ocean. Yet governments are funding the unsustainable use of our ocean with taxpayer funds. One of the drivers of overfishing are harmful fisheries subsidies. It's worth me noting here that, of course, not all subsidies are harmful, but the negotiations at the WTO are focused on regulating harmful fisheries subsidies. Harmful fisheries subsidies are damaging because they artificially lower the cost of fishing and in so doing incentivize more fishing than our ocean can handle. Examples of harmful fisheries subsidies include boat construction or fuel subsidies. Each year, governments around the world pay an estimated 22 billion in harmful fisheries subsidies. While there are many things that we can be doing and governments can be doing to ensure that we have healthy fish stocks well into the future, one of the solutions is within reach for WTO members, and it's within reach this year. To give you an example of how powerful a WTO agreement to end harmful fisheries subsidies could be if it's ambitious and meaningful, please allow me to give you a piece of a finding from a recent piece of research. A bioeconomic model developed by the University of California, Santa Barbara indicates that removal of all harmful fisheries subsidies could result in a 12.5% increase in global fish biomass by 2050. That's 35 million metric tons of fish, or equivalent, that's nearly 3 times the annual consumption of fish in Africa. This is huge. The WTO is positioned to deliver an outcome with a potentially game-changing impact if members are willing to put environmental conservation and sustainability at the forefront of their decision-making. Maintaining the status quo is not enough for developed and developing countries alike, and will simply further imperil our marine environment and our own future. My role here today is to voice civil society support for a meaningful fisheries subsidies agreement. On behalf of civil society, we want to see members reach an agreement that triggers a paradigm shift in our relationship with the ocean that ushers in a better, more sustainable future. 174 organizations from around the world have signed a policy statement calling upon world leaders to reach an agreement this year, in line with the target set by SDG 14.6. If you go on social media, you can see messages of support from diverse voices under the hashtag Stop Funding Overfishing, and I very much encourage you to do so. So to finish, to thrive, we need a healthy ocean. For economies to thrive, we need a healthy environment. For the global trading regime to thrive well into the future, it needs to recognize that it has a unique role to play in shifting our economies towards supporting the environment, not destroying it. The WTO can set rules for global trade that signal a new future in which trade and a healthy environment coexist and thrive together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Isabel, for sharing this message with all of us and for emphasizing the importance of reaching an agreement on fisheries subsidies as soon as possible. Thanks very much. I would like to give the floor now to our next speaker, who is Dr. Caroline Birbeck, Senior Researcher at the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Similarly to Natalie, I also met Caroline over a decade and a half ago, and now I'm very pleased to be collaborating on the trade and environment work streams. Caroline, it's a pleasure to give you the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Soledad, and also to colleagues at IISD for the opportunity to join this discussion today. I have the poor position of being the last speaker after great interventions, most of which I agree with. So I will try to just focus my remarks on 3 forward-looking points, sort of on the where to next, all of which I hope will help support this case for renewed stakeholder engagement on trade, environment, and sustainable development. So the first point is to propose that we need a new narrative about trade and environment, one that is both responsive to immediate crises, but it's also forward-looking, inclusive, and addresses wider sustainable development priorities. So we need to go beyond this tendency to reiterate that trade and environment goals can be mutually supportive. This is no longer enough. Looking forward, our focus must be on how trade policy can be harnessed to help drive and support the economic transformation and the just transition that's required to meet environmental goals in the context of wider sustainable development objectives. So critically, this agenda must address developing country priorities and challenges. As Rashid has noted, development is key to developing, is a key priority for developing countries, and trade is central to that. I also take his point that progress on the SDGs in the context of COVID-19 has gone backward. So it's even more incumbent upon us to find ways forward that reflect and address developing country concerns. But we also need to engage and respond to this real world dynamism, this interest of business in more sustainable production, businesses that recognize it's important for their long-term economic returns and for the resilience of their supply chains. This includes companies in developing countries as well. So looking forward, we need to recognize also that trade can be detrimental to the environment. It's not only a good news story, but it can also be supportive of environmental goals. And similarly, trade policies can be barriers to achieving environmental goals, and they can be means for doing good. So the second point is there's both urgency and an opportunity for this new phase of discussion, what I call an environment and trade 2.0 agenda. So we must put this in the context of environmental urgency on biodiversity and nature, on climate and pollution. Trade is relevant to all of these. As trade is linked to 60% of the world's GDP, it's surely obvious that it's also linked to these environmental challenges. Just this afternoon, the executive director of UNEP launched a new report from UNEP, which highlights that over the past 2 decades, trade in material resources has grown by more than 90%. That's in biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and non-metallic minerals. So over a third of that, those materials that are extracted is linked to the production of traded goods. Moreover, their analysis shows that the material footprint of trade has shifted from high-income countries to low-income countries that are more low-income countries, which also means that there's a shift in environmental burdens associated with the extraction of these natural resources. She also highlighted an example on air pollution of exports of secondhand cars to developing countries and their contribution to air pollution that we see, for example, this week in India, hindering efforts to mitigate climate change and also contributing to social problems like high road traffic death rates. Others have mentioned the export of plastic waste. And another key element I think is worth noting is that we need to find ways to recognize how trade is part of the broader climate challenge. In the case of European countries, for instance, emissions stemming from imports account for more than 30% of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. Almost 50% of the carbon footprint of UK consumption is produced outside the UK. That is, while the UK is doing a great job of reducing its carbon footprint domestically, at the same time, it's meeting many of its consumption needs through imports with an extensive carbon footprint abroad. So in this context, we have the SDG that's calling for actions, SDG 12, that's calling for action to promote more sustainable production and consumption. It's calling for us to pay attention to the way that products and services are produced. However, it's also true that SDG 12 is one of the ones where there's the least progress. A recent high-level, the UN high-level political forum on sustainable development, it was noted that existing efforts are piecemeal and fragmented with significant gaps in implementation. At the same time, we have SDG 17, which is calling on trade as a means of implementation of the SDGs and calling on countries to put sustainable development at the heart of trade policy making. So we have this sort of urgency to act. We also have new opportunities, some of which have been alluded to. The interest of the business sector in a growing range of sustainability issues and the investment sector and finance in looking for ways to invest in more sustainable production and supply chains. We have developing countries, which are those that face already many of the economic risks, shocks, and impacts of environmental degradation. They're showing more openness and interest to addressing issues of trade and environmental sustainability than ever before. There's also growing interest in environmental constituencies about how we can use trade policy to better advance environmental goals. So in light of these opportunities for change and the urgency at hand, my third point is about the key processes and priorities that could be used to drive forward a new agenda that would build coherence between environment, sustainable development, and trade goals. So the first one is not new. I mean, thinking of Rashid, I'm sure he's been talking about this issue for over a decade, is that we need to start at the national level. We need to align trade, environment, and sustainable development goals at the national level in both developing and developed countries, not just in terms of their own domestic performance, but on how their trade policy impacts countries abroad and the environment and sustainable development goals abroad. So we need to have environment interests at the table, business interests at the table, Parliament needs to have a possibility to be engaged, and we need to have and use sustainability impact assessments to inform trade policy making. And I'll just wind up because I know time is short, but as we're in WTO Trade and Environment Week, I'd like to emphasize the importance of cooperation, reinvigorating cooperation here at the WTO as well. So on the substantive priorities, Isabel has already spoken convincingly of the need for a meaningful deal this year on fisheries subsidies. Other substantive priorities are finding ways for countries at least to have some dialogue and to look for ways that they can cooperate on climate and trade goals. It's not enough for countries to say these issues are being dealt with elsewhere. They are not. We need at least to be able to have a conversation in the WTO context about these issues. For the world's nature crisis, Rashid is spot on that we need to go back and look at issues of agricultural subsidies and how we can promote agricultural trade in a way that is both environmentally sound and supports food security needs. To address the nature, the pollution, and the climate crises, there are ways that we need to find ways for trade policy to promote a more circular economy. And plastics here again is an issue that seems to be a broad interest to many members. So of course there are important challenges to this. A key one is the issue of fairness. And here a key point is that we need to find ways to have a stronger role for developing countries in this discussion. And I think here at the WTO, that means that whilst rulemaking is a key part of the WTO's core business, it's not the only business that the WTO is in. It also has an important role in promoting dialogue, promoting cooperation, problem solving, information sharing, and capacity building. And here I think that we need to offer much more substantive support to developing countries, both in the ways that the rules are shaped, but also making sure that they have support for the transition that's expected of them and to address the impacts that they're already feeling from environmental damage. So aid for trade is one area that warrants more attention. It represents 1/3 of overall overseas development assistance, and 60% of it goes towards infrastructure support. So there's considerable scope for looking for ways that we can use greening aid for trade to support more climate resilient infrastructure, to support sustainable agriculture and sustainable supply chains, to help developing countries be involved in and implement international standards, involved in the development of them, I should say. I think we also need to bear in mind that sustainability is key to making the WTO relevant to global challenges and to restoring its role as a key player in global economic governance. And so let me just end by noting 2 exciting new initiatives at the WTO. The first is the structured discussions on environmental sustainability and trade, which the FAST group will be launching tomorrow. This is a really key effort to reassert the importance of environmental sustainability. The co-sponsors include both developed and developing countries. They're committed to reinvigorating dialogue on these issues at the WTO, and critically to stakeholder engagement from civil society, from other IGOs, from the business sector and academics. This is really an opportunity to help shape an agenda going forward. And it's also fantastic to see a group of WTO members launch a process of informal dialogue on plastics pollution and more environmentally sustainable plastics trade, which also will be launched tomorrow. So I think I'll close there, but I think it's more important to turn back to you, Soledad, for the discussion at this point. But thank you so much for the opportunity.
Many thanks to you, Caroline, for sharing these 3 forward-looking points and for emphasizing the need for a new narrative, the need also to launch what you call an environment and trade 2.0 agenda, and also emphasizing key processes and priorities, the importance of cooperation, dialogue, information sharing, and capacity building, and for announcing a couple of initiatives that will be launched this week. Thanks very much. We would like to give some space for questions from participants. We see that some of you have submitted a couple of them through the chat function. We may not have enough time to address them all, but perhaps I could pick one of them. I think the common denominator is that some of you are interested in seeing to what extent some environmental measures can be pursued in the multilateral fora. Some of the questions seem to express a concern that some schemes that are more unilateral are being used to address sustainability objectives. But the question that they would have to panelists is whether these schemes should be pursued in the multilateral fora as opposed to developing schemes at the national level. I don't know if one of you would like to talk about this element. And I see another question that is linked to something that Rashid also addressed in terms of the regional trade agreements. This is a question which is more linked to climate change. What's the role of regional trade agreements in helping address the challenges posed by climate change? So we can perhaps start with these two questions, and I would like to ask who would like to address. Yeah, Ambassador Blackman, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soledad. I'll try to treat through the first question on the debate of multilateralism versus unilateralism. I'd simply say that the issue of ensuring that we achieve what we want to relative to trade and the environment, issues of sustainability, how do we tap into the opportunities of the plastics, the circular economy, how do we reduce our plastics pollution as it currently stands. These, to my view, they have to be fought on the front of multilateralism. We've seen particularly over the last 6 to 7 months that, for example, COVID-19 and the impacts on the environment, impacts on health, impacts on the global economy are best fought when done collectively. This issue of the environment is not a national issue. And to my view, it ought not to be fought on a national or unilateral basis. The environmental debate and the environmental challenges sees no borders. There's no passport that it has to apply. There's no respecter of frontiers. So therefore, to my mind, following that logic, it would be incumbent upon us to ensure that through the multilateral system, whether that be the WTO, UNEP, and the different multilateral agencies that we're part of, that has to be the way that we deploy our intellectual resources, our political will, our financial resources to fight the challenges ahead. But equally, the opportunities that we ought to tap into have to also be done through the multilateral system. And I think once we can get stakeholders to see that, then we were going to have some results. But I want to go a bit further, and I'm heartened that this question is happening during a discussion like this with civil society. For a very long time, there is a view inherent, particularly in the WTO, that all of these issues ought to be fought only by governments. No. If we don't get all stakeholders on board in every decision after thorough consultation, we're going to not see the yields that we're looking to have. So in my humble view, that rethinking also of the approach through multilateralism, which I said we should do, to my mind, notwithstanding that the institutions are government members led, there has to be a mechanism built in somehow for stakeholders who are not governments to have a very strong, clear, well-articulated voice, so as to ensure that the intellect and resources that they bring to bear are manifested through the policies that we negotiate at the multilateral level.
Many thanks for this answer, Ambassador, that it's very inspiring for all of us. Yes, please, Rashid.
Thank you, Soledad. Look, I will be quite happy if Caroline and Isabel want to go first. So I did not see their hands. I kept waiting. So then I raised my hand. Okay. So yeah, I think the questions are quite interesting, relevant, and thoughtful. We don't have the answers to, at least I don't have the answers to all of them. So I will focus on what you have very nicely summarized, Soledad. Yes, for me, clearly, as Ambassador Blackman was saying, unilateral route is not the preferred route at all. I distinguish it from a national action. Unilateral has a certain connotation, which I'm sure all of you are aware, and I don't think we would like to go down that unilateral route. So it should be collaborative, which means multilateral avenue is much better, clearly, qualitatively, quantitatively. The question is, on the multilateral front, how to do that? And again, Caroline and Isabel and Ambassador presented several good, interesting options and ideas. I'm not talking about any particular issue now, but in terms of what are the mechanisms at the WTO level. So rules, yes, one, but rule is not the only way to go forward. Caroline, I think, very clearly said, and that there could be more discussions and dialogues and through the trade policy review. So there are a number of other opportunities, and we have seen the quagmire of rules sometimes where we have been stuck for years. So WTO can utilize these other possibilities as well, definitely. And then, of course, another very important issue, which Caroline brought out very clearly, and I totally agree, the issue of capacity building, using aid for trade, using EIF, as well as using, why not, some kind of a TFA approach, that because in many cases, developing countries want to implement that, but do they have the capacity? I mean, taking example from another area, which is quite relevant for trade, is the sanitary standards, where we have seen the evidence is so much clearly there. To get a certificate to comply with a standard, the company is based in a Western European country and cost 10,000 euros to get that certificate. How many of small enterprises in developing countries would have that kind of money to get that certificate? So there are clearly these capacity questions where we have a lot of information also, and as well as examples like in the TFA. So yes, capacity building targeted to build those strengths. So that is in the multilateral front, but also, and there was a question as well, which was about the RTAs, as you said, Soledad. Yes, we should definitely, in my opinion, when it comes to these issues, use that route more and more. There are already some interesting things happening. And that's where, as I was saying earlier, my plea is more towards developing countries, that in your RTAs, try to address this issue. This is a reality. True, this is a reality for our countries also, and we are losing a lot in health terms, in poverty increase, in economic terms also, and often these are the poor, the women, the misses who are paying the price of environmental degradation. So this is an issue for developing countries to address. So address it, try to address it, that aspect in their own RTAs, create the best practices, which that can be upgraded and brought to the higher level. So this will be my responses to the question, Soledad, that you had posed.
Many thanks, Rashid. I would like to ask Isabel and Caroline whether they would like to add something before we turn to Natalie for the concluding remarks. Please.
Hi, Soledad. I'll quickly add something, but I think Ambassador Blackman and Rashid have both sort of touched on very eloquently the importance of reaching a multilateral agreement, and really, to tackle, as Ambassador Blackman said, to tackle environmental challenges, we need everybody to be together in dialogue and cooperating and willing to take on responsibilities, because countries, alone cannot do it. And secondly, I think really to achieve a true leveling of the playing field, we need a multilateral agreement. We need to see the big players take on big responsibilities, and we need all countries to come to the table to ensure that happens. And I think Rashid's point about multilateralism allowing for the resources that developing countries might need for implementation is also really important. That's part of that dialogue and that cooperation. So I think that's bringing all those pieces together is why multilateralism is so important to tackling a problem like overfishing and to reach an agreement on fisheries subsidies. Thank you.
Many thanks, Isabel. Caroline, is there anything you would like to add, please?
Just very briefly. Thank you, Soledad. yeah, I guess the key point that we're that we're kind of struggling with in this panel is this challenge between addressing the environmental urgency, because there is an environmental urgency and it touches all countries. It touches the livelihoods of people all over the world. It's not a developed country issue, it's a global issue. And it is urgent. It's urgent for our children. And I think everyone understands that this is really critical. And it's critical as a development issue also for countries, for all countries. The challenge is we have to find ways of matching that environmental ambition with a way that doesn't punish countries who are behind, who are struggling to meet these expectations and these standards. So there's no point for developed countries proposing or imposing what they think is the right way forward. We need to find ways that we can discuss and find ways forward that work for all countries and businesses everywhere. And in that case, they're going to be more sustainable solutions as well, because people are going to feel that they have buy-in into them. So from this point of view, I think the multilateral approach is just critical, and a collaborative approach is critical. Now, that's not to say that we don't need key, big trading partners to be aggressive with each other on some of these issues. I mean, some of them, there are countries that are laggards, there are countries that are falling behind. If I was a small island state, I'd be furious with the US and the EU and China and Brazil and all kinds of countries who are not doing enough to tackle climate change. I'd be furious, and I'd be pushing for them to get as much out of each other as they can on this issue. But by the same time, I wouldn't expect to be pushed around having to bear the burden of this if I was not one of the countries most responsible for the problem. Right? So I think we just need to think much harder about who is responsible for these environmental footprints, and how we can find ways that responsibility is integrated into how we frame trade cooperation and move forward on trade cooperation. And to do that, I think building trust is critical, and finding many more ways where we're actually engaging countries and experts within countries in concrete dialogues about real ways forward, rather than lecturing each other. And that there's just a lot of capacity to be built on these issues, and listening to be done, I think, looking forward. But I really do hope that we're at a new cusp of this. I feel like this is a different discussion than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so there are ways forward. And hopefully there'll be new energy at the WTO in the coming months and years for looking at those issues.
Many thanks, Caroline, for sharing these views. It has been a fascinating conversation. With this, I would like to hand the floor over to Natalie for concluding remarks. Thanking you very much for your attention and for joining us. Natalie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Soledad. And actually, I don't even have to do concluding remarks, because everybody summed up so well. And Carolyn at the end really gave a closing remark, and she picked up on all the issues that were mentioned. And I really like that she picked up also the issue of urgency, which was very much heard in the voice of Isabel. And at the same time, the issue of trust. And that's at the center, something Rashid also said, and Carolyn also brought into the wrap up. So Carolyn, I thank you very much, because now I can be very short and just thank everybody for this fascinating discussion, especially Ambassador Blackman, Rashid Kaukab, Isabel Jarrett, Carolyn Deer-Burbeck, and my colleagues, Peter Wooders, Soledad Leal, and Sofia Balino, who was working behind the scenes and will write up what you all said so that people can read and listen in later on as well. So many thanks. Have a great evening or a great afternoon. And some people might already be just about to fall asleep, to go to bed. So thank you very much, and stay healthy in these very strange times. And we look forward to being in touch. Bye-bye.